In today's video, our topic is data visualization, and we are going to talk about what makes a data visualization effective and also learn how to use ggplot in R to construct data visualizations. Now, when you're collecting data and analyzing it, you may have some results that you may be tempted to put into a table. Tables are a very convenient way of presenting results. However, it's not always the most effective. They take a lot of time. So for example, if you're giving a presentation or you're watching a presentation and someone puts a large number of numbers in a table on the slide and you have 10 seconds to kind of read through it, you're probably not going to be able to identify all of these trends and relationships. Instead of using tables, we recommend using plots where possible or other data visualizations to convey complex relationships. They tend to be a little bit quicker to digest, and we can use a number of tools to emphasize different relationships that we want to show. Now, in order to have your data visualization be effective, there's two sort of rules that I like to follow. The first is that we need to convey the message. So your data visualizations should answer a question, or it should relate information about a relationship that you want your viewers to understand. We should do this by making sure that our legends and labels are visible, that we have a caption and titles on our table, and that everything is nice and clean and organized. We should also make sure that when we're conveying the message, it's accessible for everyone. So if you are using something like colors to indicate different groupings, make sure that that is colorblind accessible, or use another tool like shapes to indicate groupings in a relationship. The second thing that we need to do is minimize distractions. So maybe you're tempted to just make your plot look pretty by adding all of these different colors in. But that can create a false sense of relationships, it can create false patterns, and just overall be distracting. So we want to make sure that our plots are answering the question in the most simple way possible. We are going to introduce ggplot2 today, which is a package in R that the R community really loves for plotting. You will find that if you have sort of a weird edge case or something that you want to plot, chances are someone has already posted about it on the internet. So the internet is a great resource for when you're learning ggplot2 because it can be a little bit intimidating at first. We're going to walk through a fairly simple example of our first scatterplot using ggplot2, so let's get right to it. To follow along with this example, you're going to need a couple of packages in R. These are dplyr, ggplot2, and R color brewer. So if you don't have these, make sure you install them using the install.packages command, and you can install multiple as using a vector if you'd like, something kind of like this if you don't already have them. So once you've installed them, you can run these library commands to tell R that yes, we want to use these packages in this session. So as a motivating example, let's look at that mtcars dataset that's built into R. Here's the first couple of rows. We have a bunch of data on different cars. If we wanted to convey the relationship between, say, the fuel efficiency, miles per gallon, and the number of cylinders and the horsepower of the car, perhaps we'd want to make a table. And we could do this, but if we look at the dimensions of this data set, you have 32 rows and 11 columns. Well, we'd probably use 3 of them. It might not be immediately clear what we're looking at in terms of these relationships. So instead of using a table, let's create an effective data visualization. So my primary goal is to look at the relationship between miles per gallon and horsepower, but I'm also curious if the number of cylinders plays a role into this. So we're going to be kind of looking at 3 different variables, but the primary relationship is between horsepower, HP, and miles per gallon, MPG. To start off with our data visualization, we are going to call the ggplot function. And this takes 2 main arguments. The first is the data set, and that's our mtcars data set. And then we have this mapping argument, which we call in this AES function. And within AES, this is where we map our aesthetics. So we can tell, for example, that we want something on the x-axis. In our case, it makes sense to have horsepower as our x-axis and miles per gallon on our y-axis because we want to see the effect of horsepower on fuel efficiency. And miles per gallon is a measure of fuel efficiency. So when we run that, nothing really happens. All we're doing is initializing that plot. So let's make that a little bit bigger so we can see. We have to add layers to this plot to build exactly what we want. Now, before we get going, what I want to do is actually utilize that pipe that we learned in dplyr. So we can actually pipe mtcars dataset into that ggplot function. So remember, the pipe just says, okay, whatever functions are called, I want you to use this, whatever is being piped, as the first argument. So we are going to say, instead of data equals mtcars, we just don't have to put anything there. And all we have to do is call that mapping. And we get the exact same plot. So let's build on this one instead, just because we already know how to use a pipe. Now let's add a layer. So we are going to put a plus sign indicating that we don't want the ggplot to just stop there. We're going to add another layer. And for this example, we have numeric data. HP, horsepower, is a number, and so is miles per gallon. It makes sense for us to look at a scatterplot here. And we can do that by using geom_point. So when we call that layer, we add that layer to our existing ggplot that we initialized with the mtcars dataset. We can see a scatterplot appears. And we can already sort of see a trend. There is a decreasing trend as HP increases. So as horsepower tends to increase, the miles per gallon also tends to decrease. So cars with higher horsepower tend to be less fuel efficient. Now this plot is fine, but we can make it a lot better. So let's elevate this. I said before that we also want to look at if there's a relationship with the number of cylinders. So let's try to color these points by cylinder. Within the aesthetic, we can name a color. And we can say, well, let's color by the groupings of this variable. Now, if I were to call sil right now, it's not going to do exactly what we expect. It is going to create a gradient of colors, even though there are only 3 types of cylinders in our cars. So let's look at those values. You can either have 4, 6, or 8 cylinders. Nothing in between, nothing more, nothing less. There's 3 categories. But because cylinder is a numeric in the data set as it's read in, R is going to think that we can have any range of values and try to color them this way. Not super helpful. So what we should do is actually, before we start plotting, let's overwrite that cylinder variable and tell R that we want this to be a categorical variable, even though it's a number. We can do this using the mutate function. And if you forget what that is, you can check out the video on dplyr. And we're going to call mutate on mtcars. We're piping it in, so we don't have to actually give that first argument. We can just tell R what new covariate we want to make. In our case, we're just overwriting it. We're going to say, let's make a new variable called cylinder, the same that it was named before. And we're going to assign it to a factor. So this is overwriting our original cylinder variable and just saying, okay, let's assign it as a factor and overwrite it. And then we want to continue that pipe to plot. So let's see what happens here. Ah, that's better. So we have these kind of reddish dots representing 4 cylinders, these greenish dots for 6, and these bluish dots for 8. Pretty cool. You can see some distinct grouping happening here. But anytime that we use colors in our data visualization, we should pause and think, is this accessible? There's an estimated 1 to 10% of the population who is colorblind in some way. So we want to make sure that we're not just relying on colors here. And if we do have to rely on colors, let's make them colorblind friendly. I'm going to do 2 things here. The first is I'm going to change this color palette. I'm going to do that by calling scale_color_brewer. And this comes from that R color brewer package. And they actually have some nice palettes that exist, I just Googled which our color brewer palettes were colorblind friendly. And I found one that's called Set 2. A bit more muted, but even with varying degrees of color blindness, these colors are said to be more distinct than our default values. We can also take this one step higher. So instead of just relying on colors, let's change the shape by group. So again, in our aesthetic mapping, let's say shape equals sill. So we are going to change the shape of those dots based on the group that they are in for cylinder. Cool. Now we have 4 cylinders are green circles, 6 cylinders are this pinky triangles, and 8 cylinders are these purplish squares. So even if you were looking at this in black and white, you could distinguish between the groups. Now let's add more informative labels to our ggplot here. Well, the XLab HP isn't that informative if you don't have the context, so let's call it horsepower. And we'll do the y-axis at the same time with ylab. And when we run that, now we see that those labels are updated. The last thing that I really want to do is to change the name of sill here. I'd like it to be number of cylinders. Now we have to be a little bit careful because we have sort of 2 different mappings to that cylinder. So we actually have to specify this name of this legend twice, and I'll show you why. If I only say the labels for color is number of cylinders, it's going to leave me with 2 legends. If I say, well, let shape equal number of cylinders as well, that fixes our problem, and the legend is correct. I'm also going to add a title using ggtitle. Again, I just want to remind you that I have plus signs after each layer that I'm adding, and I'm going to add the following title. It's quite long, so what I'm going to do is include /n somewhere to allow for a line break in that title. So you can see here that and appears on the next line. If I were to omit this, my title would run off the page. You can play around with where to put that /n based on the length of your title. And there is one final thing. I keep saying final thing. There is one final thing that I'd like to do. So let's add one more layer here. I am going to change the theme. There are a number of different themes, and theme_minimal is one of them. So after the GG title, I continued by adding another layer, and I can see that the background is turned from gray to white. Totally a preference, what you'd like, but for me, because these colors are a bit light, I find this one a bit easier. There's also a theme_black and white, and you can Google all sorts of themes that exist. So this is really an improvement over our basic black and white scatter plot. It allows us to really look at the relationship between 3 different covariates on a 2-dimensional graph. So we can see as the horsepower increases, we tend to have less fuel-efficient cars. And also, we do see these distinct groups. Cars with higher horsepower tend to have higher numbers of cylinders, whereas cars with lower horsepower and that are also more fuel efficient tend to have lower number of cylinders in the car. So let's just summarize what we've done with the code. We took mtcars and we overwrote that sill as a factor to allow it to be grouped in our ggplot. We then initialized our plot with x as horsepower and y as miles per gallon. And then we grouped our data by cylinder in terms of color and shape. We plotted a scatter plot, created a colorblind friendly palette, renamed our labels, renamed our legend, added a title, and changed the theme of our plot to be a little bit more plain. And there you have it. You have your first plot. There is really so much to learn with ggplot that this is only the tip of the iceberg. And I hope this gives you the confidence to go out and explore how you can make your own effective data visualizations. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.